He was a very violent person, and now all of a sudden, there's a manhunt for him.
She's terrified. Her and her family are living in fear.
His behavior was so deviant and disturbing. She was always looking over her shoulder.
This becomes somewhat of a media frenzy. This is not your typical murder suspect.
Gloucester is one of the oldest fishing communities in the United States. My name's Tom Farmer. I'm a former journalist. I was a reporter at the Boston Herald. It has a blue-collar fisherman vibe, but it also has a great cultural scene. There's many artists that live there, so it's a very diverse, interesting community. It also has some very affluent areas where there are multi-million-dollar homes with ocean views. Karen Sharpe is a very warm person. She was the mother of 3 children, and she was very well liked.
She was as sweet as sugar. She was so generous. Everybody was taken in by how amazing she was and what a great mother she was. I'm Erin Shapiro, and I'm a partner at Atwood & Cherney, a law firm specializing in domestic relations. Karen was lovely, she was vivacious, and I will say that the sun rose and set for those 3 children. Richard was a very successful dermatologist. He was affiliated with Beth Israel Medical Center in Boston, which is a world-renowned hospital.
He is a doctor at Harvard Medical School. I'm Dr. Joni Johnston, a clinical and forensic psychologist and private investigator. Richard is seen as somebody who is incredibly bright and gifted, very driven.
This incredibly eminent doctor at Harvard was described by his colleagues as an upright guy, a nice guy. I am Professor Donna Youngs. I am an investigative psychologist. A huge professional and career success, Richard was a very motivated and focused individual.
They had the ideal marriage from the outside looking in. They were wealthy, very successful. This was an affluent family who, by anyone's account, had everything going for them. They purchased a property in Wenham, Massachusetts, which is a small upscale community on the North Shore of Massachusetts. It was partially constructed, but they saw the potential for it and wanted something more than Gloucester offered.
He parks his car, turns off the headlight, and walks to the door. He is approaching the house with a gun.
He rang the doorbell and asked to see Karen.
Karen answers the door.
She sees a rifle for the first time. She turns around to run and get away, and he shoots her in the back. And this is in front of her brother, as well as the babysitter. Also, the 2 youngest children are at home, although they're asleep. And he turns around and leaves.
Karen's brother Jamie made the 911 call to police.
911 emergency?
And when you listen to that call, I've always been struck by how calm and direct he was. He was obviously upset. He was obviously traumatized.
Karen is rushed to hospital and dies at the hospital.
I was a general assignment reporter at the Boston Herald, and we became aware that there had been a murder in the town of Wenham, which immediately piques our interest because that's a community where they don't have many murders. They may not have had a homicide there in decades. It's a very affluent community. It's a very small, quiet community. So obviously it was something that we immediately sought to cover. It was a huge story.
Karen trained as a nurse, and Richard, although initially an engineer, went on to medical school, ending up with a residency at Harvard Medical School and then a teaching post at Harvard as well. Alongside being an eminent dermatologist, Richard was also developing a hugely successful cosmetic dermatology business, a business that earned millions by developing a hair laser removal system.
He was making about $100,000 a month in connection with his laser hair removal business. And his laser hair removal business really was cutting edge 25 years ago, and he had 18 different sites at that point in time.
So they had accumulated probably $3 or $4 million worth of wealth through investments and through his business enterprises.
They were a wealthy family by anyone's standard. The marital home in Gloucester, Massachusetts was a 14-room residence.
Karen and Richard Sharpe met in Connecticut.
They were high school sweethearts.
She was from a family that moved around quite a bit. Her father was CEO of an electronics firm, so it was very nice for her that she met Richard pretty soon after she transferred. And before long, they were a couple. Both of them were interested in being a couple, but they weren't necessarily ready to be parents, as most teenagers are not. And so it was quite a surprise to both of them when Karen found out when she was 17 that she was pregnant and expecting.
Richard and Karen tried to hide the pregnancy until it was impossible, absurd to deny what had happened.
That threw her family for a loop and probably his family for a loop as well, and there's a lot of discussion about what to do. And so she was able to finish high school, he was able to finish high school. After a lot of kind of back and forth, her parents were not super excited about the two of them getting married. Karen initially was pretty ambivalent about getting married as well. Richard, however, was set on marrying Karen and there being a family. He was somebody who, from the very beginning, was very, very interested in, I think, getting his way in some respects. And at one point, he even talked to her father in what some people might consider a disrespectful way. I think her father was trying to reason with him and talk about how young they were. And apparently, Richard said something like, well, she's 16, she can do what she wants to.
And the couple married shortly after Shannon was born.
There were some red flags. Richard seemed to be pretty obsessed with Karen. He wanted to be with her all the time.
Shortly after their marriage, week 1, he threw an alarm clock against the wall because he was angry that she didn't wake him up for work.
At one point, Karen runs away and hides, not telling Richard where she's going. All of which indicates that she's scared, that she's fearful in some way or another.
She was really confused about the relationship, and she went to stay with an aunt in Philadelphia. And he was trying to track her down. At her parents' house, he actually appeared out of the bushes and asked her sister where she was, because Karen didn't want him to know where she was with the baby.
The need to hide, it has a menacing, threatening quality to it, which is a warning sign of coercive behavior.
Richard and some friends went over to her parents' house and actually saw the aunt's address posted on a bulletin board and actually went over to Karen's aunt's house.
And gets Karen and brings her back. All of this smacks of somebody being forced to do things against their will out of fear.
At the time of the murder, they were going through a divorce. Karen had left Richard. She was living in the house in Wenham. The Boston Herald petitioned the court to unseal some of the documents that had been filed in the case because Karen Sharpe was deceased. And fortunately, I think it was a single justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court decided there was a public interest in releasing those documents. So I remember being in the probate court in Salem, Massachusetts, and getting that first copy of her affidavit and restraining order paperwork. And it was eye-opening, to say the least. What we learned from that, he was a very violent person, and that Karen was feared for her life.
I was a young attorney assisting the senior partner at the time in Karen's representation back in the spring of 2000. She had fled the marital home, which was then in Gloucester, Massachusetts, about 3 weeks earlier. She took the 2 younger children with her, so she was coming to us to initiate the divorce proceedings at that point in time. So we always asked them to provide a client narrative, outlining for us the history of the relationship. We learned in that narrative, which was chilling to read, and I still remember 25 years later, the abuse that she endured at his hands. She had been brutalized by Richard Sharpe for 27 years, both verbally and physically.
What we learned from that paperwork was that he was very controlling and very violent, was a classic domestic batterer. And, you know, she endured a couple decades of hell living with him.
By 1976, he is starting to become physically abusive toward her.
I recall Karen telling me he held her captive for over 48 hours in their home, and he was physically and emotionally abusive the entire time. It got to the point that she was so badly beaten, she was begging him to seek medical attention. He ultimately said she could. He insisted on going with her and instructed her to tell the medical authorities that she had fallen down a set of stairs. While they were caring for her at the emergency room, he whispered in her ear, "I hope you die."
We're talking about serious physical abuse. On several occasions, she is injured and has broken bones, her nose is broken, she's got black eyes, but she doesn't tell them or even her family about the extent of the physical abuse that she's experiencing. I think there were several times in their marriage when Karen was really wanting to leave. In 1991, she had actually asked him for a divorce.
And that rage in him just built and built. He lost control. He attacked her and stabbed her in the face with a fork.
He's tried to strangle her. He did seek psychiatric treatment at that point in time.
And is hospitalized in a mental health institution after this.
I believe through his attorney, he was able to get himself out of the mental institution. As we've seen so many times in these tragic domestic violence cases, Karen recanted the allegations and would not cooperate with the investigation, so it went away. And that's the heartbreaking thing about this case. For whatever reason, they recant, whether it's the batterer saying that he's going to change or that things are going to be different. But ultimately, it did not get better, and it got worse. You know, we've seen this before where couples are having issues and they say, well, let's have a baby, let's have a child to refocus the marriage. Then they had a third child, and I have no doubt that Karen was deeply concerned about the kids.
Richard was a man who never was incredibly involved in his children's lives. He didn't attend extracurricular activities or parent-teacher conferences. In fact, he instructed their older daughter to call him Rich, not Dad.
Richard apparently is suffering from multiple psychiatric disorders, from severe depression, intermittent explosive disorder. He has a whole range of psychiatric diagnoses. And all of these psychiatric diagnoses seem to be triggered, activated, when Richard drinks alcohol.
At one point, they go to a high school reunion, and she's talking to a DJ and former friend of hers that she maybe went out on a couple of dates with in high school, and she asked that this certain song be played, and it was apparently the song that her friend liked as opposed to Richard's favorite song, and he throws a drink on the DJ. And there are just endless examples of this.
He had been involved in a trademark infringement suit, which was threatened against him. And as a result of that, he had transferred numerous assets to her name and their daughter's name, and he transferred $2.9 million from a Fidelity account, which was in his name, to Karen's name alone at that point in time. So she finally, I think, had some sense of security given the fact that she, for the first time in their married life, had some control over the family finances.
And so I think this gives her almost like a breath of fresh air to think, okay, we do have this money. I could possibly leave.
He came home with duct tape and hoses, and that was coupled with his already erratic, volatile behavior. So I think at that point in time, she certainly was genuinely concerned about, not only her well-being, but the children's as well.
I think she was just living with a tiger that she was trying to hold by the tail and keep things from completely spinning out of control until she finally said, I can't live my life like this anymore. We got to get out of here, and I got to get my kids out of here.
I think that was the proverbial last straw that made her pack up the children and leave the house.
And so she starts plotting this out. One day, Richard comes home and he says he's not feeling well, and she said, well, go upstairs and we'll get some tea and have a snack. And she packs the children up while he's asleep, and she leaves. And so he wakes up to an empty house and freaks out. She moves into the house that they were renovating, and she starts trying to use the legal system to her benefit.
He actually filed the complaint for divorce first as a knee-jerk reaction to her fleeing the house with the children. It is not what he wanted at all. I think he was absolutely obsessed with her, and his ego was bruised. For the first time in the relationship, he lost control. One thing that we urged her to do was seek a restraining order against him. The restraining order was to prohibit him from having communication with her at all, but unfortunately, he continued to violate it. And I would call opposing counsel and say he's following her right now in the car, or even by virtue of the fact that he was sending her roses. Karen was reluctant to call in the violations of the restraining order out of fear of retaliation by him.
She makes sure that she renews this protection order, every 30 days. She's very vigilant about that.
She did live in fear, and she was always looking over her shoulder. And even though we got the restraining order, his behavior was so deviant and disturbing. I remember one day she called me and said she had just gone out to the mailbox to get her mail, and she opened the mailbox, a bird flew out. He had put a bird in the mailbox. Just another illustration of his mental state. I do think that for the first time in her adult life, she was enjoying the company of friends, and she was socializing more than she had, without the concern of, getting beat up on the way home that night from him leaving a party.
I think she might have felt like, maybe I could really stop my own life now. Also, Richard did have a girlfriend. He went on to live his life, but he was consumed with Karen.
There's fighting over the millions of dollars that the business they've built up together has made. There are visitation rights about the children. We know that during this time, Richard loses his job at Harvard for neglecting his duties. This is one messy situation that's unfolding. For somebody like Richard, for all these things to fall apart, for everything to be taken away from him when he's been so successful, so in control, will be experienced as an incredible sense of disrespect to him, will be making him feel incredibly angry.
He was consumed with losing control. He was consumed with what he thought he was going to personally lose financially.
We had scheduled his deposition, which would obligate him to appear at our office. We could ask him anything relevant to the divorce. He was clearly upset that we were going down that path. And in fact, he had sent Karen roses and begged her to cancel the deposition on Monday. She wanted nothing more than to disentangle herself from him, but the fear remained that it could end in serious bodily injury or death. She was petrified that he would kill her.
There were witnesses to him walking in the door with a rifle.
He shot Karen in front of her brother and a babysitter that had been in the house. You've got 2 to 3 eyewitnesses who witnessed the murder, who knew Richard. Now all of a sudden, there's a manhunt for him.
I received a call from my then boss, the senior partner, who was also representing Karen in connection with the divorce, to tell me that Richard had killed her the evening before, that he hadn't been apprehended. It was absolutely devastating, absolutely devastating. And I was a young attorney. I had only been out of law school a couple of years at that point in time. And I can still remember Karen saying to me in court one day when the two of us were talking alone, "Don't ever let this job get you jaded." And I'll tell you, it was hard to heed to that advice in what followed in the next few weeks. The police called me and asked me to go into our law firm. And I can still remember going in there that day in order to retrieve for the police information regarding Richard's license plate and registrations. They owned a few vehicles, and the police needed that to try to apprehend him that day. It was a little unnerving, to say the least, to have to go into that building knowing that Richard hated my former partner and me probably as much as he hated Karen.
The police got a tip that he was staying in the state of New Hampshire, which is north of Massachusetts.
The police release a photo on the news, and this photo is recognized by the owner of a motel that Richard tried to get a room in.
And the person says, "I'm sorry, we don't have any vacancies," but refers him to a hotel down the street. And the person recognized his picture on the news and says, "This is the guy that I think showed up last night at my hotel." And so he contacts law enforcement. Law enforcement is extremely concerned about what's going to happen when they go to get him. And so they take a lot of precautions. They essentially evacuate the guest of this hotel. You know, they're thinking, are we going to have a shootout? Is this person going to come out gunning for the police, whatever? They end up taking Richard into custody without really any incident.
He was found 30 hours after the murder. I was so relieved, so relieved. And I commend local law enforcement because in some respects it was like trying to find a needle in a haystack.
So Richard is taken into questioning, and this becomes somewhat of a media frenzy, I think for a couple of different reasons. One is you have a cosmetic dermatologist, millionaire, who is a former doctor at Harvard. This is not your typical murder suspect. On July 14th of 2000, he has a date with his new girlfriend. They go out to dinner. He has 2 to 4 glasses of wine. So he's definitely under the influence at this point.
Which we know triggers the psychiatric disorders from which he suffers. He's also taking painkillers for an injury at the same time. This is a potent cocktail. This is a dangerous combination of substances within him. And we know it gets him into a very agitated state.
Before they go back home, they stop at a friend of his girlfriend's house. She had offered to close the windows for a friend of hers because his friend was maybe out of town. Richard insisted upon going in with her. It later on turns out that he had stolen a rifle from this home.
It's clear that he's so agitated, he's not thinking straight. He feels he has to do something.
His girlfriend goes back to her house. He ends up driving over to Karen's house. He parks many feet away, turns off the lights to his car, and he sneaks essentially up to the house, opens the door, and sees Karen.
And when she sees Richard, she grabs her restraining order and waves it at him, warning him off.
That enrages him.
I think this moment when Richard's standing with this high-powered hunting rifle at the door, he was the one in control, he was the stronger one, he was the one with the gun. And in that moment, he shoots Karen.
After he shoots and kills Karen, he gets in his car, he stops for gas, he uses his own credit card.
And drives 90 miles to stay in a motel.
We went to probate court where the divorce had been pending and immediately asked for them to freeze, if you will, all of his assets and filed a wrongful death suit on behalf of the children immediately to try to preserve as many assets as possible for the children so Richard wouldn't have access to those. Those kids were Karen's priority, the loves of her life, and I think we were acting in accordance with what her wishes would have been, certainly.
We learned Richard Sharpe was a cross-dresser. We had photos. I still remember being like, wow, this is out there.
I don't think the Boston Herald wasted an hour before they posted pictures of Richard dressed in women's dresses.
When the pictures surfaced of him dressed as a woman, that was kind of like throwing gasoline on the fire. It was very sensational and got a lot of media attention, not just here locally, but nationally and internationally. So that just kind of turned the whole case on its head.
You have a former doctor at Harvard who's been known in the community for years, been very successful, wearing slinky stockings and wearing some women's garb. And so this, of course, is salacious.
It went beyond just a simple domestic violence murder. There was all these side issues of him stealing Karen's birth control pills and prescribing himself hormones so that he could enlarge his breasts. So it was very bizarre.
For Karen, it made her very uneasy, and it was something that he had started doing later towards the end of their marriage.
People following the case were very interested in it, and they couldn't get enough of it. They wanted to know more. He's a guy that was very successful, and now all of a sudden, he has nothing. His fate depended upon 12 people in the jury, so things were looking pretty bleak for Richard Sharpe. This was definitely a page one story. All the TV trucks were lined up outside, and there was a large media presence. And we're all competing with each other to find little tidbits of information that the competition might not have. I had a good relationship with the lead state police detective in the case because I didn't like getting beat on a story. He was dressed in a suit. He had long shoulder-length hair. And for the most part, he sat at the defense table. He had made a couple of outbursts, I seem to recall, and then he's warned not to do that again.
His defense attorney and Richard pled not guilty by reason of insanity. And their main defense was that he was temporarily insane.
Richard was one of those people that did think he was smarter than everybody else. And, you know, he obviously planned this very poorly. Because he killed his wife in front of eyewitnesses, and he didn't leave him much legal ground to stand on. So his only option was to take the insanity route defense. But it's not very successful here in Massachusetts. I've seen several instances where defendants have tried to use the insanity defense, and it just doesn't fly with a jury.
Richard was in a deaf position, and his defense attorney was as well. And so they had doctors testify to the effect of his mental health history, the fact that he had been in a psychiatric hospital in the past.
They had a defense psychiatrist who claimed that he was not responsible for this because he had like 6 different personality disorders, including major depression and this violent outbreak personality. And then you had psychiatrists for the prosecution that said, no, he's not insane. He knew what he was doing at the time of the murder.
It was a really, really tough hill to climb because I think for a couple of reasons. One is, you know, Richard is somebody who has a girlfriend. There's indication that he's moved on. There's all this premeditation that came in. He steals a weapon. He turns off the lights to his car. He kind of stealthily goes to the house. And these are all indications of premeditation. You know, there's nothing about this that seems impulsive.
His testimony was interesting. He seemed to be active in his defense with his attorneys, but when they put him on the stand, he tried to portray himself as being in some kind of trance-like state. And he would be mumbling or looking down and moaning, you know, talking very monotone. Richard's testimony about the night of the murder was that he doesn't remember getting a gun. He doesn't really remember driving over there. He was not in control of himself. He just got this monotone delivery. It was almost painful to watch. If he hadn't killed his wife, it would almost have been like laughable, but it was pretty disturbing.
I mean, he was a very bright, well-educated doctor who had training at the top elite colleges and universities in the United States. I think that was nothing but an orchestrated ploy to try to convince people he was mentally ill, to try to escape the conviction.
But when it came time for cross-examination, Robert Weiner, who was a very experienced prosecutor, he wasn't having it. And he was pretty effective at ripping his testimony apart, which unnerved Richard more because he was being confronted. He was not having any of this, you know, mumbo jumbo that Richard was in a trance and that he was mentally ill and that he was on medication and there was nothing he could do about it. He had to sit there and take it. And Bob Weiner did a very good job of painting him to be the monster that he was.
At trial, Richard Sharpe admits that he did feel a compulsion to dress as a woman and that this had all started when he had first, as a small boy, hidden in the bathroom away from his father.
His father also seemed to have a trouble with alcoholism and was described as somebody who was extremely physically and psychologically abusive to all the kids, particularly the boys. And so Richard really grew up in a family that was scary, unpredictable, abusive. And I think as he grew up and his older brothers left the home, the brunt of his father's anger really began to be focused on Richard.
His father would rant and rave while Richard hid, terrified, in the bathroom, knowing, however, that his father would not break down the bathroom door because then he'd have to repair the door. Now, this is a really curious type of violence. This is a really dangerous type of violence. It's violence with a degree of control.
He discovers his sister's clothes or lingerie or in the bathroom for whatever reason, and he decides to put them on. And he describes this as a kind of a really significant experience for him. He reported feeling this sense of comfort, this sense of release and calm when he did this. And this became something that would repeat itself throughout his life.
This whole rage within him built about Karen moving out and that Karen was trying to steal his money.
The prosecution said that Richard had 3 million reasons to kill his wife, and they each had a dollar sign attached to them. They basically said he did it purely for money, The thought of him losing $3 million to his wife was unbearable to him. And for that reason, he decided it was better to kill her than to go through a divorce.
Anytime you think it's a slam dunk for the prosecution, sometimes verdicts come in that completely surprise you.
There wasn't a doubt in my mind he would be convicted of first-degree murder. This isn't a man who just snapped in 2000. She endured his abuse for 27 years.
He just kind of stood there and closed his eyes, and there was kind of a gasp from Karen's family. And there was some tears, there was some hugging and crying. And on Richard's side, there wasn't really anybody there for Richard. It was just him and his attorneys, and he was taken away. He was kind of like whiny. I think the reality set in that the gig is up. I'm going to jail for the rest of my life. So he was very upset. I think when he's lying there at night and he's thinking, I'm never gonna leave this place alive. My life is over. I don't have any real chance for an appeal, that he finally decided that he'd rather be dead. I believe he just had had enough. And the big thing with these domestic batterers is once they lose control, and in this case, I think once he had lost the control of any chance of getting out of jail, that he lost his desire to live. This was a tragic case all around, but the real tragedy is what he did to Karen and the kids.
I don't think a week goes by when I don't think of what transpired 25 years ago. And I often think about her children and hope that they are doing well because they lost two parents in the process.